Hi there, this is Solitary Ronan from Solitary Ronan Films, and welcome to another episode of Double Take. Today's Double Take features two films by Penelope Spheeris, who have recently been released on 101 Films' Black Label, which is Suburbia from 1983, her debut fiction film, and 1985, The Boys Next Door. So Penelope Spheeris was one of the first women who ended up having a career from UCLA film school. She started off in the technical office, working with equipment. She ended up doing music videos before people really knew what music videos were. And then she did one of her 3 documentaries on the decline of Western civilization. The first one looking at the punk rock scene, the second one looking at metal and the Sunset Strip in LA, and the third one in the 90s kind of looking at the kind of homeless punks in LA again. Obviously she is kind of more famous for doing Wayne's World and then comedies, but as she says in the interviews in these releases, she ended up getting like $2 million a time for those comedies, which, let's be honest, on the whole aren't very good, and that's why, as she says, she's known more in real estate nowadays as actually a film director, because she's not really interested in doing films anymore. She makes her money from real estate nowadays. She does say in one of these interviews that she kind of wishes she could go back and not do those comedies and actually do films that she was really interested in, but because Wayne's World was just so successful, she almost just got typecast as doing these comedies, and she got paid well for doing it. So nobody really wanted to see the decline of Western civilization, the first part, because punk rock in America at that time, people were just scared of it and didn't really want to see it in cinemas, certainly a documentary about it. So she ended up writing a script for a fiction film, Suburbia, set in LA, following a group of these kids that have essentially been from broken homes and left their homes and have made their own kind of family within the punk rock scene, and it shows the friction between the local community who just are scared of them and don't understand what's going on, but they've actually created them through their sexual abuse or drug problems or alcohol problems, and these kids leave their homes and essentially fall into this world. It's interesting that 101 Films have released these back to back. They're released pretty much within a couple of weeks of each other. They're spy number 21 and 22, so it literally is a Penelope Spheeris double bill. Again, with the Black Label ones, you get a nice booklet. Again, they'll probably release them as standard releases as well, but some nice images and essays, and the extras in these are pretty good. The Boys Next Door's probably got better extras, but Suburbia has a really good interview with Penelope Spheeris, and it has 2 commentaries, one with Spheeris herself and another one with Spheeris, the producer, and actor Jennifer Clay. So again, like I said, that interview is really good. She talks about, at some point the Weinsteins kind of bad mouthed her enough to almost getting her blackballed But then at that point, she was just doing these comedies that weren't really very good, and that's why she ended up getting into real estate. But Suburbia was co-produced by Roger Corman, and it's fascinating to hear her talk. I mean, she's naturally funny as well, but talking about the kind of film that she wanted to make and the film that Roger Corman thought he was making. He wanted a kind of teenage exploitation film. She wanted to do something a bit more serious because she's always been interested in the kind of counterculture, because she had a kind of rough upbringing herself as far as moving around, and her father died and her mother remarried about 7 times. So she moved about a lot herself. So Roger Corman kind of agreed for her to do it, but he wanted kind of, sex and violence every 10 minutes because he thought he was getting a teenage exploitation film. So there's like a kind of kissing scene which Spheeris said she didn't want anything to do with. She didn't want that in her film, but it's in the film because kind of again Corman wanted certain things, very much like the Italian films of the 60s and 70s, whether it's the giallo or whether it's the crime films. You've got to have something happening like every 10 minutes to keep the audience engaged. So there's lots of non-professional actors. Again, Spheeris wanted that because, as she said, it's easier to teach a punk how to act than it is an actor to be a punk. One familiar face is Flea, the bass player from Red Hot Chili Peppers, who is credited as being the Flea in the credits. He was homeless at the time in the early 80s. Obviously he's went on to act in quite a few films. He plays Razzle, who has a pet rat and attempts to tame the wild stray dogs that are in this rundown area of LA. The film opens with a hitchhiker being picked up by a woman and her kids in a car. The car breaks down in the kind of wasteland area, and while they're making phone calls, these wild stray dogs come out and attack the kid, and that's like the start of the film, and then it just cuts to something completely different, as we focus on this character who again lives with an alcoholic single parent. So he just leaves, tells his little brother, who would join him later in the film, he's just going to leave and wander the streets, and he falls into this, there's a punk concert going on, and he kind of falls into that crowd, and he gets introduced into this gang called the TRs, which stands for the Rejected. And again, it's these kids who have essentially left home or been kicked out of their home, and they just try and survive. And again, they live in this rundown abandoned house. They're essentially squatters, and they essentially form basically an extended family of their own, looking out for each other. So again, they're rough around the edges. Yes, they get into trouble, but again, all of this is essentially created by their parents and the families and the economics that has basically caused most of this area of LA, or the suburbia that they talk about, as just being completely run down. And then we also have the community who obviously don't understand them, are scared of them. There's a couple of guys who go out hunting the dogs, the wild dogs, and they clash with the TRs, and then you can just tell this is going to escalate, and it does escalate until the end of the film, where tragedy strikes. There is a community police officer who's actually one of the kids' stepdads, who is trying, or the kind of leader of the TRs, and he's trying to kind of get them to calm down and go back to their their houses, but again, it's just that lack of understanding and the disconnect and the communication between these two groups of people. It's a really interesting film. Again, it's rough around the edges. It's not a masterpiece or anything, but it is really interesting. One of the other nice things on the interview with Spheeris is she does have a go at the Pet Shop Boys, who released a song called Suburbia not too long after the film, and use things from the film in it. And she says, she still has lots of scripts that she never got done, but she didn't say what they were in the interview because she felt the Pet Shop Boys would probably rip it off. Our interview is really funny and really educational as well. So that's Suburbia, which is a really interesting little film, as is The Boys Next Door from 1985. And this stars Charlie Sheen in one of his early roles and Maxwell Caulfield. And again, the extras on this one are probably even better. Again, you get the booklet and the special editions. Again, these will probably be coming out in standard edition at some point, about 101 films. And that's just the alternate artwork. So this film starts with kind of newsreel footage and voiceovers talking about serial killers. So you've got like Sam Berkowitz and Henry Lee Lucas. So it's kind of built up as a serial killer film, but it's not really a serial killer film. It's about these two characters who are leaving high school and don't fit in. And you can say, well, these two guys are really good looking, so why wouldn't they fit in? But again, it's about economics. The rest of the kids are kind of rich or from kind of well off backgrounds, and Charlie Sheen and Maxwell Caulfield's characters are dirt poor, live in trailer parks. So yes, from our perspective, it's like, why wouldn't Charlie Sheen and Maxwell Caulfield fit in? Because they are like good looking guys, but it's because they're poor. So again, it's that economics. Again, it's funny when people think that America doesn't have a class system, and it's like, of course America's got a class system. You either got money or you don't. So they don't fit in. They have jobs waiting for them. They're literally graduating on the Friday, or high school's ending on the Friday, and they literally have jobs in the local factory waiting for them on the Monday. So they decide, this is like Northern California, so they decide, outside LA, so they decide to go to LA for the weekend to blow off steam and just party, and then report to their dead end factory job on Monday for the rest of their lives. Now Charlie Sheen's character is kind of, he's not necessarily happy with that, but he's kind of resigned to that. Whereas Maxwell Caulfield's character, you can see just the way he looks at things, looks at people, there's definitely something else going on with him, and he's not content to just, you go into the factory on that Monday and then 30 years later, you're retired or whatever, 40 years later you're retired, and there's got to be like something else, so there's something else going on. So they get to LA and obviously things get out of hand. The extras on this one, like I say, are really good. There's a commentary again with Spheeris and Maxwell Caulfield. There's an extended interview with Stephen Thrower, who we all know from plenty of other boutique label commentaries and features, called Blind Rage, which is wonderful. Both Sides of the Law is an interview with Maxwell Caulfield and Christopher McDonald, who plays a cop, who's must be one of his earliest roles as well. Give Us Your Money, interviews with street band performers, Texacala Jones and Tequila Mockingbird, because when they're in LA they see this street band perform. Caveman Day, there's a cinematics interview with Penelope Spheeris and Maxwell Caulfield. Tales from the End Zone, there's an interview with Kenneth Cortland. And there is a featurette on the locations, and there's alternate opening title sequence and extended scenes, which don't have audio. But the extras in this one are really good as well. So when they get to LA, Charlie Sheen is more interested in just having a drink and getting laid, essentially, as quite a lot of these high school and college films are basically about. Whereas Maxwell Caulfield, he has definite issues going on. He has a lot of anger in him, and he has a lot of feelings, which we'll get to later. So, Charlie Sheen is kind of just being dragged along, whereas Caulfield is definitely the leader of the two. So they're looking for a drink, but also they're underage. They end up in a gay bar, and of course they don't realise it's a gay bar until they walk in, and it doesn't seem to be too many women about. So they decide to go home with a guy who picks them up. And again, Charlie Sheen isn't really aware of what's going on, but Maxwell Caulfield is aware of what's going on. They've already kind of robbed somebody just to get some cash, and again, it's Maxwell Caulfield saying, he's getting his back on society and getting his revenge on the people that have ignored them all these years and let them down all these years. So Maxwell Caulfield, when the guy goes and gets some drinks, he's immediately taking his shirt off, and obviously the guy thinks it's his lucky night, and Maxwell Caulfield attacks him, chokes him, and they end up killing him. And again, for no real reason. Again, Spheeris kind of says in the interviews, she's kind of little bit, there's more violence in this than she would have done, when she was older, as quite a lot of filmmakers do when they look back at their early work. But the violence is done really well. It's really sudden and brutal, and it's not glamorized. And then they get a gun, which the guy had in his apartment, and then things just escalate. There's a woman that Charlie Sheen kind of gets obsessed about, and they follow her with her boyfriend, and things progress and progress. But it's obvious throughout the film that Maxwell Caulfield has a thing about women. There's definitely a misogyny there, and it's pretty obvious he is actually sexually attracted to Charlie Sheen, but he can't actually articulate that, and that just leads to more anger and more resentment within him. And there's at one point Charlie Sheen meets a woman in a bar, and they go back to her flat, and her and Charlie Sheen start having sex, and Maxwell Caulfield's in the kitchen, pacing about like a wild animal, and then he can't take any more, and he literally explodes, which is kind of what Charlie Sheen's doing as well. And he goes and attacks the woman, because the thought of Charlie Sheen actually having sex with a woman drives Maxwell Caulfield up the wall. So the whole film is just an escalation. Again, Charlie Sheen is pretty much just going along for the ride and kind of helping his friend out. But at some point he kind of says, this has gone too far. But Caulfield at that point is just beyond stopping, essentially, because it's that combination of your future is just going to be ridiculously bleak, which again, Charlie Sheen, his character accepts that. You go work in a factory, you get married, you have kids, you retire, you die, um, which is what we do, even though we kind of accept it, whereas it is unbelievably bleak. Whereas Maxwell Caulfield's character doesn't accept that. Granted, he has, psychopathic tendencies going on, and he would rather obviously not do that. And because of the events in the film, he will not work in the factory on Monday morning. So again, is it rough around the edges? Yes. It kind of starts as one of those kind of frat boy, obsessed about getting drunk and laid films, and then it kind of morphs into something a lot darker. The violence is really good. It's really interesting when we see Christopher McDonald and he's the more veteran cop, and they're trailing them as they kind of leave this path of destruction through LA, and his feelings of what's going on and how he feels powerless. We just turn up after the event to clean up the mess. There's an interesting conversation between Sheen and Caulfield when they're at La Brea tar pits, about how, very much like The Purge, there should be a day where men get to just act like cavemen and just do what they want, and even though that's mostly what men do anyway, you should be able to hit a woman over the head and drag her home. I was like, okay. So it's a fun little film, but there's kind of deeper stuff going on, but it's well worth a look. Interesting performances by both Caulfield and Charlie Sheen, and again, both films have moments of really hard and shocking violence, but they're done the proper way. They're not glamorized or sensationalized in any way. They're just interesting little films by Spheeris, and it does kind of make you wonder what would have happened to her in her career if Wayne's World had never happened, or had Wayne's World not been such a huge hit that she kind of got comedy project after comedy project that weren't really that good, but like she said, she got paid a lot. And in the interview, she does kind of say that she does regret maybe holding out to make the films that she actually wanted to make, rather than just taking the paycheck and getting into real estate. So thanks very much for watching this double take on Penelope Spheeris. Let me know if you've seen Suburbia or The Boys Next Door and what you think of them, or what your favourite Penelope Spheeris film is, and hopefully you'll join me again for more double take episodes. This is Solitary Ronan from Solitary Ronan Films, saying thanks for watching and farewell.